So please join me in giving a warm welcome to a senior economist and a state economist. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for having us. As Tom said, our prime directive is the economic and revenue forecast that we give quarterly to the legislature and the governor. And so most of the stuff that we're going to present today comes out of that, comes out of those quarterly revenue briefings that we give to folks. So I'll start out with a little update of where we are in terms of Oregon's economy, and then talk a little bit about the flavor of the outlook, and then we'll get into some more some issues about, well, what's missing in terms of rural areas or middle wage jobs and some of the things that haven't come back with the rest of the economy. And then we'll talk about some risks going forward, in particular one that is driving a lot of interest and debate right now is the housing affordability across the state. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and then finish up with the time that we have. We'll try to finish up with, see if I can turn this up a little bit. We finish up with some discussion of the tax revenues, where we are in terms of the revenue outlook. If possible, we'll also look into some of our smaller, more interesting revenue streams at the very end. So with that, what about the economic recovery? What about the expansion right now? The way I've been describing it lately is that the economic expansion has reached middle age, which means we can't move as fast as we used to, unfortunately. And that's what's happening in Oregon. But that said, a lot of good things come with age. And so as we've entered deeper into the recovery, we've taken a lot of the slack out of the economy, so we can't really expand the amount of jobs at the same rate that we have over the last couple of years. But nevertheless, now we're starting to see deeper measures of improvement. As the labor markets and capital markets have tightened up, we've seen the benefits start to go further down the list of qualified workers, and we're starting to see our lower income households start to gain. We're starting to see people start to spread outside of the Portland metropolitan area and our big metropolitan areas, and we're starting to see rural Oregon improve across the way. And so we're starting to see a lot deeper measures, even though going forward we can no longer expect to maintain the same kind of blockbuster rates of growth that we have over the last couple of years. But in general, we will just do it with this. Recent performance has been pretty good. Recent performance in terms of Oregon's labor market has been, still looking good. We won't get into all of these details, but these are all different measures of what's going on with the current labor market. Employment, the unemployment rate, wages and salaries, and weekly hours worked in manufacturing industries, which tend to dip before things go bad. Manufacturing firms decide, well, before we fire people, we're going to cut back on their hours, maybe take a shift away, things like that. And so you see this move before you actually see employment move. But so far, we're stuck right up about 40 hours a week, which is good. And for all the others, up and to the right is good for wages and employment. Down and to the right is good for the unemployment rate, where we're bouncing around these historic lows with some really volatile data lately. But from the coincidence stuff, there's not a whole lot of cause for concern at this point in time. Everything's still up and to the right, although, as you see, there may be a little bit of slowdown we have seen in terms of income and the rate of job growth. But we're still look pretty darn good relative to the typical state. This graph shows employment growth rates in Oregon, the dark line, versus the rest of the U.S., which is the light line. And in every expansion since World War II, Oregon has outperformed the typical state. We do very well when the U.S. economy is growing. Our resource industries and our manufacturing industries tend to be on the upswing. We have a lot of both of those. We're a place that still makes things, and so they tend to be on an upswing along with the general business cycle. But also, when there are jobs here, we bring a lot of people in, which is happening again now. We get an ample supply of skilled workers anytime jobs are available, and so we see this push. And so these two things really are the biggest factors behind the fact that Oregon always outperforms during expansions, and certainly has this time to date. Our problem, of course, comes on the other side of the business cycle, is during recessions when we typically outperform as well, because we have these terrifically horrible recessions that hit, as you see in the last couple. But in Oregon here a year or two ago, we were growing about twice as fast in terms of jobs as the average state. But that can't happen indefinitely. What happens is we take a lot of the slack out. What do I mean by that? Well, in 2015 and 2016, not only were we getting a lot of people moving to Oregon who want the jobs, but we're also having a ton of folks come off the sidelines, unemployed or discouraged workers who now have better job opportunities, higher pay, and better opportunities. And so we were getting this labor force was boosted not just by people coming to Oregon, but also by workers who were to the side because of this big old recession here. So we had a big army of unemployed workers. We've been tapping it for 3 years, and now it's looking like getting thinner. And so what are firms doing? They're starting to bid up wages. They're starting to hire people that maybe aren't quite as qualified and the like. And as a result, we're starting to see a little bit of a slowdown in terms of the potential expansion. And employers also have trouble now necessarily getting maybe their contractors time or supplies for their production, just given that we've been going full throttle for a couple of years. But nevertheless, still looks pretty good relative to the typical state. And cheating ahead to our outlook, that's what we expect is to continue. We can sustain over the long run, growing along the lines of the labor force that we bring in. And at those rates, it's still looking pretty good relative to most places. Here's a little picture of the regional recovery in Oregon, which has been uneven, but is getting more and more encouraging as growth starts to spread more and more outside of the Portland metropolitan area. The way to read this chart, I'm sorry it's a little bit tough to read, but we start with the dark bars on the left. The dark bars on the left designate what share of jobs were lost during the Great Recession. So for Oregon, on average, lost about 8% of its jobs during the Great Recession. The hardest hit places in the epicenter of the housing downturn, Central Oregon and Southern Oregon, lost 16%, 12%, so 50% or twice as much in Bend, 50% more in Southern Oregon than the typical Oregon area in terms of how hard they were hit. Then we move over to the right, well, this is where we are today. And so Oregon's taken this 16 percentage point swing over the last decade, going from down 8% of jobs to now 8% more jobs than we had heading into the recession. So what really stands out here is the huge swings. Of course, the metropolitan areas, the bigger the metropolitan areas, done better, as is true across the U.S., but these huge swings in our housing metros, the ones that took the biggest housing downturn and swing back. In Bend, or Central Oregon is the biggest example here. Here you're looking at a swing of 27% over 10 years. If you just looked at Deschutes County, it's more like a third. So increasing the job base by a third in over 10 years that's just remarkable, almost hard to believe. But we have encouraging signs even down here. Some of these places in the South Coast and Southeast Oregon and the like still aren't back to where they were before the recession started, but nevertheless are now starting to accelerate. While the broader economy, and particularly Portland and Oregon's big job engines, are now slowing down because they're starting to reach these capacity constraints. They pulled out all the slack, and now it's harder going. Now we're starting to see these places accelerate. The Klamath counties and the Josephine counties and Curry counties of the world are now growing faster than they were in 2015, which is particularly encouraging. So with that, I'm going to switch to Josh, who's going to talk about how some of this is now getting translated beyond job market into some things that are even more important to us as both economists, or both as residents and forecasters, and that would be income.
Thanks, Mark. Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here again in front of you guys, even if it is a new venue relative to where we have been in years past. But anyway, as Mark was saying, we're starting to finally hit that feel-good nature of the business cycle, right? We add a lot of jobs, we put a lot of unemployed people back to work, and only then do we start to see wages start to rise, household income start to rise, poverty begins to fall, and we're maybe not fully healed on these measures, and we're certainly not healed in every single community across the state. But again, this only happens during a mature part of the business cycle, and from here till the next recession, we're really expecting all of these good things to continue to happen. Good income growth, falling poverty rates, and declining caseloads for needs-based programs, particularly when it comes to things like food stamps and Medicaid and things like that that really are based on how a household is doing. And here, this chart in front of you talks median household income. So if you lined up, just as a quick math refresher, if you lined up every household in the state of Oregon from the lowest income to the highest income, the median is the one right in the middle. And here we're comparing that middle household, that median household in Oregon, to the U.S. And typically we have lower income. This is probably something you've seen discussed and reports about it over the years, talking about how Oregon has lower income than the typical state or the average state across the U.S. And that's true. When it comes to the median, though, we're probably 2 or 3 percentage points lower than the typical household across the entire nation. Today, with the last couple years of good economic growth translating into income gains, we're now statistically tied. We're a hair below. We're 0.1%, less than $1,000 difference between the typical U.S. household and the typical Oregon household. And again, we're on the upswing. We're seeing good improvements. We've caught the U.S. here in Oregon, at least based on the most recent census data that came out a couple weeks ago. But the other thing you'll notice about this chart is we know we've had stagnant income trends for most workers for the last 20 years, right? So it's not perfectly stagnant year after year after year. There's movement around that trend. And so we've had downswings during recessions, some growth during expansions. And again, we're on the upward trajectory today. We're seeing good gains, but we still haven't really broken through where we were 20 years ago. And so it's a good news and a bad news situation, but today it's certainly a glass half full sort of look at it. And if the expansion continues another couple years, which it probably will, again, we're expecting further gains here, and we'll finally break through this 20-year stagnant trend over the next couple of years. Now, whether that's permanent or not, or we just come right back down to this level, it's kind of about the nature of the next business cycle and how Oregon does and which industries are growing versus contracting and things like that. But again, we're finally seeing the strong economic growth we're seeing in jobs and wages translate into improving economic performance for the typical household in Oregon. And it's not even just the typical household, it's also for those at the bottom of the income distribution as well. And what this chart does is look at household incomes by quintile, so the top 20% of households, the middle 20% of households, which is basically that median we were just talking about, and then the bottom 20% of households. They're indexed, they start in 2000, so where were you at the start of the Great Recession, and they follow you over time, and how are you today here in 2016, the most recently available census data. And you can see here we're all back above 0%. So on an inflation-adjusted basis, household incomes for those at the top, the middle, and the bottom part of the income distribution are all the way back to they were a decade ago. Again, so there's been flat for 20 years, but we're now starting to make progress in seeing this. And these gains, particularly these gains here in the middle and bottom part of the income distribution, are all about a strong economy. These households only have wages in the social safety net. That's all they have for their sources. And so they can only get income growth if they get a job, and then their employer's paying them more because it's a tight labor market. The people at the top have been doing better for a generation at this point, right? They have a wider range of income sources. Generally, they have a high-wage job, whether it's a doctor or what have you, but they also have capital gains and rental income and a wider distribution, and so of asset markets and things like that. And so as those have done better than labor over the last 20, 30 years, so too have the incomes at the top. But again, we're finally starting to see these gains filter through to those down here at the bottom. And again, we're talking about people that have $20,000, $25,000 a year in income, which isn't very much. It's hard to make that stretch far enough, but at least the trajectory is in the right direction. Here locally in Salem and across the Willamette Valley, we've seen these income gains also. Salem is now has the highest median household income in the Willamette Valley. At least if we're cutting off the northern Willamette Valley and Portland, which is higher income. But Salem has not only surpassed where it was a decade ago, but it's also started to catch Corvallis too, just by a nose. But we're seeing that all turn around, right? Corvallis has turned around, Salem has turned around, Albany is now turned around, and Eugene as well. Their economic growth started maybe a year or two later than it did here in Salem, but again, they're starting to see good gains in the labor market and household incomes. Again, the drivers of this growth here in Salem are all for good reasons. We're seeing big gains. Last year for the median household income, this is not inflation adjusted, it's up 6.5%. So adjusted for inflation, we're talking just under 5% because inflation was 1.5% or so. A little more than that, 1.8. So household income gains were 6.5% for the typical household here in the Salem metropolitan area. And you can see we added 1% more households locally, almost 2% of households with wages. So that means we're adding employment at a 2.5% clip. That means we're now having more earners per household. So that's one way you can get better income, right? Is you can have more people working in your household, so therefore your overall number goes up. But more importantly and encouraging, full-time employment is up 5% here in Salem in the past year, right? So we're not just getting job growth, we're getting full-time year-round employment growth at the same time. And that makes the median earnings for the typical worker, they're getting a 4% gain year over year. And that's mostly because we're switching from part-time jobs to full-time jobs. For those people that are working full-time year-round, their earnings were only up 1% overall. So they're not getting a lot more pay per hour, at least here in the Salem metropolitan area, but we're getting a whole lot more people switching from part-time jobs to full-time jobs, and that's what's really driving the income gains in Salem in the last couple of years, which again is all about the economy that's driving these things. We finally hit this part of the business cycle. And with that, turn it back over to Mark.
Sure. So going forward, the nature of our outlook is, well, how much slack is left, how much in terms of the job market in particular, and it looks like not a whole lot. This is a graph trying to look at the folks that are out of the job market relative to the number of job openings. So we take the number of unemployed plus those who probably should be in the labor market given their age and their in the place, but they're not. So the missing participants. To try to get a broader sense of the folks that may be discouraged or outside of the labor market, in addition to what we get from the employment department, who do try to study these things, but just more broadly, looking at the size of the population, how many folks are missing from this labor force, given our, and we're down here to about, 2 of these people per job opening, which is as low as it was during the tech boom and as low as we've seen. So in terms of measurable folks out there that are healthy of prime working age, things are pretty tight, at least by this measure. And it looks like we may have a little bit left to go, but we're probably almost done with this recessionary bounce in terms of labor force participation or bringing people off the sidelines. It was really encouraging. About a year ago, we started to see a big jump up, not only in participation and measures of wages and the like, but also in folks that would just come straight off the sidelines into the job market. They would get, the surveyor would come by one month and ask, do you have a job? No. Are you looking for a job? No, I don't want one. And then the next month they come by and they have a job. And so this is someone's neighbor coming up to them and say, hey, we've got another spot where I'm at and it's pretty nice. Or their old boss coming and saying, hey, we're opening up another shift. We could really use you to come off the couch. And folks are, right? And so, this is great. We're starting to pull people back in. But what really muddies the whole concept of, well, how tight is the labor force or participation, or how tight is the labor market, is the aging of the baby boomer population cohort, folks heading into their retirement years. Because we knew over time, we were going to see fewer people in the labor force just because of the demographics moving through and not because of the business cycle. And so to try to net this out is what we do in this little picture, where we have this dotted line, which we call the demographically adjusted full employment, LFPR, which is a mouthful. But all we're really doing here is just, well, let's think about if everyone by age cohorts, or every 30-year-old female, if they worked in 2000, if say 70% of 30-year-old females were in the job market, we would assume that from this 2000 snapshot, we look at, okay, what's everyone's labor force participation, and then just let the population age over time, and what would the rate be if everyone participated at the same rates as back in 2000? If all these age subgroups participated at the same rate as 2000, and so that's the benchmark to where maybe we would be in a healthy economy. A little arbitrary, picking the 2000, depending on where you pick, that's going to tell you where you, so that it's a little bit arbitrary, but nevertheless it gives a good benchmark. And so the actual participation rate drops heavily when there are no jobs, particularly following the recession, but we've seen a lot of increases over the last couple of years, to the point where we're almost back to this longer term trend. And so that's really driving what we have in terms of an outlook going forward, which is to say slower growth. That as we go forward, we're not going to be able to maintain these 4,000 or 5,000 jobs a month that we were seeing during the peak of the expansion a couple years ago. Instead, it's going to look a lot more like our population growth, somewhere around the range of 3,000 a month. So employment can't grow as fast, but with the tight labor market, we're really starting to see a lot of improvement deeper. And Josh is going to talk a little bit about that, starting with some of the reason why folks are still out of the labor market.
As Mark was saying, we've got this nice labor force response, this nice bounce back in the share of people that are actively looking for a job. Either I have a job or actively looking for one, but we're still not all the way back. And this doesn't account for the fact that we've seen even more drastic changes for what's called the prime working age population. That's 25 to 54-year-olds have seen a larger decline in over the years, and then the reasons why some of them aren't looking for a job today have shifted, right? So this, when they ask you whether you have a job or not, and you say no, are you looking for a job? You say no. And then they ask you, well, what are you doing, right? What are you doing with your time? What is the reason for not having a job or not looking for work? And here's kind of all the answers that you can give. You can say, well, I want a job, but I'm discouraged and there's no job for me, so I gave up looking. I'm going to school, so I can't work because I'm going to school. I'm at home taking care of the kids, or I'm at home taking care of the family. I'm ill or I'm disabled. I can't physically work, even though maybe I'd want to. I just can't make it in. Or I'm retired, right? I have a nest egg, or I'm nearing retirement age, or I started a company and sold out, or whatever the case may be. And then there's an other category, which is a catch-all for anything else. I'm not entirely sure what that would be. And so what we've tried to do is look at this labor force response. How many more of these people that are currently not looking for a job can we reasonably expect to bring back into the economy, particularly as we're in a tight labor market today where firms are having trouble finding workers, or at least they're claiming they're having trouble finding workers, and the like. And we kind of lined them up from left to right on the more likely to return to less likely to return, right? If you're in school, we've seen school enrollments here at Willamette and across the universities in particular, a big surge in enrollments following the Great Recession. That was partly demographic. The millennials were entering into the peak millennials, the middle component of the millennials were entering into their college years, so enrollments were going to surge anyway due to the demographics. But secondly, there's no job opportunity, so that calculus of whether I should go work after high school or I should go to college definitely tilted even further to college because you couldn't get a job in 2008, 9, 10, 11, or 12 when you're 18 and don't have any experience. And so the silver lining to an increased enrollment in school is they will come back back to the labor force when they graduate, and they will be better suited for some of the job growth that we're seeing. They'll have better skills, they'll have better social networks, they'll have better employment opportunities and the like. So this isn't so worrisome. And in a strong economy, these discouraged workers, we're bringing them back anyway for the most part. So these are all well and good, and they're not necessarily as big of a problem today as they were a few years ago, and less of a concern. This taking care of the kids or staying at home for family reasons is a little bit of a harder one to dissect. Some of this is a social change. The last time we saw this huge increase in stay-at-home moms like we're seeing with some of the millennials today, the last time we had this large share of young moms staying at home was when the millennials were babies and we had the boomer moms staying at home and not so much in the labor force. And so some of it's a societal generational shift. The other thing you'll notice here is a big surge in stay-at-home moms, a tiny little increase in stay-at-home dads. It's true that the number of stay-at-home dads, the share of young fathers that are staying at home to take care of the kids has doubled in the last generation. Millennial men are staying at home to take care of the kids twice what they used to. The problem was they started at 0%. So when you double 0%, we're now up to double that in terms of the staying at home fathers. There's more men out of the labor force than there have historically, but they're falling to these other reasons. They're not, at least not admitting to government survey workers that they're staying at home to take care of the kids. The biggest concern and the biggest increase we've seen is this share of folks that are saying they're too ill, they're too sick, they're disabled, they can't work. We don't know, we don't have a good reason to understand why this is the case. There's a couple different theories that are out there. One of them is that maybe some of these, when someone's asking you why you're not working, they're saving face. Maybe there is an issue in the labor market where they can't find a job, and they're just saying, well, I have a bad back, and instead of responding and saying, well, nobody wants to hire me. They're saying, I can't work because of my back. That's one interpretation. There's probably some of that going on. The other one is this truly reflects a public health crisis, right? These people are answering honestly, and they're saying, I have problems, and I can't physically make it to work. And this is where you start to tie it into some of the public health data, and you bring in things like the opioid epidemic. People are addicted to painkillers, or then they switch to heroin and fentanyl and things like that. And so they can't hold a job because they have these big issues. And we're seeing this across the nation, right? The opioid epidemic is, front and center, page one of the newspaper or homepage of the newspaper screens, and people are talking about it. As our office has started to look into this, because this is such a large driver of those staying at home not working, it's become an economic problem too for the economy. It's not just a public health crisis, it's become an economic hurdle at the same time. It's really broader than the opioids alone. Here, some new research coming out of Princeton in the last couple of years. A couple economists, Ann Case and Angus Deaton, they have termed this deaths of despair. It's not just opioids and drug overdoses, but it's also alcohol-related death, where your liver gives out and whatnot because you've been drinking heavily for an extended period of time, and suicides. So if you add all three of those together, of which the opioids are the smallest component, alcohol-related deaths and suicides are considerably larger than opioids. They just haven't maybe increased to the same degree as drug overdoses in the last decade. Here you can see these are white non-Hispanic men in Oregon from 2000 to 2015, which is the latest mortality data that we have. We're talking 100% increase in these related deaths. And this is a big challenge. It's a societal catastrophe. It's a public health crisis. And this is pushing back on overall life expectancy increases, right? Cancer's going down, smoking-related deaths are going down. All these things are trending down for a lot of the population, so life expectancy is getting better. However, these deaths of despair are pushing back against that trend, and mortality is not improving. And it's primarily concentrated within the white population in the U.S., and it's particularly concentrated in the non-college graduate white population in the U.S. And we're seeing the same things here in Oregon. And this is, again, it's a public health crisis. It's a social catastrophe, and it's now an economic hurdle to job growth. And so what are the things you can do about this? What is the reason for these increases? And the hypothesis that Case and Deaton from the Princeton economists put forth is one of cumulative economic disadvantage. You start particularly with folks that without a college degree, they lost their job, or their job opportunities aren't what they once were, and so their economic point, or their economic life is worse today than it was before. And you know, it takes a long time for some of these alcohol, drug, and suicide things to come to fruition, where you finally see them in the mortality data. And so it's one where we see all sorts of social safety nets and the social fabric of our community start to decay, where we're seeing lower marriage rates, big increase in children born out of wedlock. We're seeing some of these other things that come to fruition within the white community that people used to attribute it to some of our communities of color in the generations past. And so we're seeing these big trends over time. They think they're putting forth the cumulative economic disadvantage story as a problem, or as one hypothesis for it. That also means the solution isn't overnight. First of all, what are you going to do about some of this? It's a public health issue, so increasing access to public health care, or health care in general, price and access and adequacy of our health care coverage is important, particularly when it comes to counseling and addiction treatments and things like that, to the extent that it's an economic one, and we've had these long-term structural trends in the economy where we've had stagnant wages for some of our blue-collar jobs. You know, that's not going to turn around overnight, nor maybe will that turn around at all, you know, significantly in the next couple of decades. And so the solution to this is not a near-term thing. We're talking about maybe trying to fix some of the access to healthcare improvements in pain medication and getting away from the opioids and using something else. You know, that's kind of where the research, this new research, it's not fully fleshed out. As you can tell from my talking, neither is our office's research on this as well. But again, this is something that is now an economic issue, and that's where our office kind of stepped in and started to look at some of this.
So I think that's probably, I guess we have a couple more minutes before the break. So I think it's probably a good place to break. We have a couple more minutes before the break. The only one we skipped was surrendered driver's licenses. This is one where, just in terms of the population gains here, we're saying I think we're at probably about topped out as many folks as we can bring in any one given year, particularly given how tight the housing market has become. I think we're about there, and we finally started to see this sputter out. The census data, the best population data, doesn't come in a timely manner for us. We have to wait a year before we get the mid-year from last year. And so we look at other things. We look at van lines data and school enrollments. And this one, how many folks come to the DMV with their driver's license from California or another state and say, I need an Oregon driver's license. And this measure just really blew up over recent years, as you see here, to darn near 100,000 licenses at an annual pace. So, of these monthly licenses. But it finally started to top out as well. And this makes a lot of sense in terms of just the capacity that we have to bring folks in. So that really does solidify this outlook, that we're probably thinking about slower growth going forward, but more improvement in some of the underlying measures that Josh was mentioning, the poverty rates and the need case loads for need-based services and the like. But as he showed you before, there are still some missing gaps to the expansion so far. So that's just about our 11:10 break time. So I'm not sure. Okay. So we do have time for a couple questions if you guys would like. Yeah, thank you. Oh. I'll repeat the question as well until we get a mic.
You may not know this as an economist, but do you happen to know
Here it comes.
why the swings in the Oregon economy, both lows and highs, are much greater than the national average?
Okay, the question was, why are the swings in the Oregon economy much more drastic, more boom-bust than the national average? And they're the two main factors. The one is we still, although less so than in the past, as with everywhere, we're still really a place that makes things, a goods manufacturer. We have a lot of manufacturing firms, even in our metropolitan areas compared to other places. And we have a lot of resource-based firms. And what resource and manufacturing industries are is they're super boom bust. And they also tend to be coordinated with the U.S. expansion very much so. And so in the past, this has been a big part of it, that back in the 70s, my predecessor used to say when they closed the mill down, all the mill workers would just go to the bar, have a couple beers, and wait for the phone to ring, and then they'd all be right back up. And big swings up and down. Well, we don't see that much, but it still is part of it. And we certainly saw that at the beginning of this business cycle, and in the 2001 business cycle when our tech manufacturers got hit. And so that's still a big part of it. But the biggest part is the migration trends. That as soon as we have jobs here, here come folks. And so first of all, they add a lot of demand for housing and retail trade and consumer services and the like. So that helps. But more importantly is they're bringing cheap labor, this ample supply of skilled labor. We don't have Stanford University or MIT here in Oregon, but we can get a Stanford-trained engineer to come here at a discount relative to other places. And that's a huge advantage. And so for our workers, and to hold down the cost of labor, which is the biggest cost to people. So but that all unwinds when we don't have jobs, right? And so and so we get this real big surge, and it's really, this last business cycle has really been very much the same in terms of this huge surge of folks, that just push our growth faster than the typical state. So that's, I think, the biggest part.
Hi, my name is Bill. One of the trends I've sure seen in the last 10 years or so is increasing traffic, Salem, Portland, Salem to Portland. It's basically coming to a stop. Is that affecting employment and business, and isn't it going to get even worse?
Yeah, I'll let Josh answer that one. Let me pull it. There it is. There you go.
Yeah. Right, this is total vehicle miles traveled across the state, urban, rural, cars, trucks, all combined. And really what you'll see here is something, we've had massive behavioral shifts. We are driving considerably less today on a per car, per person basis than we ever have before, or really since the 1970s. It rose up and it's been falling. The other thing that you'll see here is a ton of price impact. When gas is expensive, we don't drive as much because it takes away from our budget, or maybe our budget can't stretch as far. And so we really started to see when we got the oil increase a decade ago, we really started to see total miles traveled in the entire state went down even as our population was increasing. So that means on a per person basis, our vehicle miles traveled was plummeting. Then it was low for a while, maybe some recessionary hangover effects, but gas was also expensive again. In the last couple of years, with the oil crash in 2014 again, we've seen this take off again. Traffic statewide is up 10% in the last couple of years. You dissect that, it's maybe 60% driving behavior, 40% population growth, right? We have more people, so even though we're driving less per person, if we're getting more people, that'll push this number up. And so there's the freight mobility issue, I think, is part of what you're maybe getting at, where even though traffic congestion is most pronounced on the interstates here in the Willamette Valley, when products made in rural Oregon get shipped abroad, or they get shipped to California, or they get shipped to Seattle, or what have you, they still have to go on the interstates through Portland to get on a boat or to get on rail or some things like that. And so the traffic congestion we're seeing here in the Willamette Valley is impacting freight mobility statewide. Now, the classic economist answer to that is we need to properly price the roads, which is tolls, and that is not very societally popular. And Portland is working on maybe putting in toll plans for I-5 and I-205 over the next couple of years, as the legislature just told them to work at that plan a couple months ago.
One more on that one. Just in addition to freight, there's also the cost to all of us, and our time is worth something. I just wanted to anecdote from Don Negri uses this in we have to do transportation hearings a lot for highway cost studies. And we tap an economist here from Willamette, Don Negri, from the department, to come and help us out. And he tells the story in front of the legislature that works really well. He says, okay, even even when there's no traffic, it still costs me, because if I'm going to if I have a flight at Portland Airport, I now know there's a lot of traffic up there, and so I'm going to leave a good hour early. And so that costs me whether or not there actually is traffic. If there is traffic, fine, I sit for a while and I make it on time for my plane by, by a little bit of time. But there isn't traffic, then I get to the airport and I sit there and I stare at the beautiful carpet for an hour or two, But either way, there are costs involved.
I'm Gwendolyn, and I have a follow-up question. To what extent, if any, does the lack of convenient transportation or alternative transportation affect the ability to fill jobs, because people have to have a car, and so because we don't have good bus services and stuff like that, does that have any impact on our ability to hire people or get the labor force working?
No, it absolutely does. It absolutely does, and this becomes more and more an issue because it's intertwined with the housing issue here. And so it's not a problem for our big anchor employers, right? You have the folks out on the west side, the Nikes and Intel of the world, and they have a bunch of employees that are happy to live in Center City and reverse commute, and vice versa. A lot of people out in Beaverton that are coming downtown to work. But the issue really gets on your lower wage workers, or the low and the middle wage jobs that start to get priced out of the metropolitan area. And at that point, then we start to get potential shortfalls. And, if it's not terribly pronounced in Oregon yet, but certainly could be. The example out there that the scariest one is Palo Alto, California now. They haven't built for 30 or 40 years because they've been very against growth and sprawl. And now they're talking about publicly they need to subsidize workforce housing so that they can get enough teachers and firefighters in the area. Now, these aren't low-paying jobs. A teacher and a firefighter, those are pretty decent jobs. And if you can't afford a place, that's saying something.
Hi, my name is Franca. My question is about people that are retired. Do you consider, I know you're talking about people that have jobs or are pulling back from applying, but people that are retired that maybe move to the state after they're retired, do you calculate that as an economic unit? I mean, they bring in money, they buy houses, they provide work for other people. I haven't heard you address that as a factor in economic growth.
Oh, heck yeah, and it's a huge factor, particularly for a lot of our rural areas. We'll hit on this a little bit further after the break, but it's huge. But it's hard for us as economists necessarily sometimes to measure the impact of retirees. Why? Because we don't have the data that we do for younger workers. For the younger workers, it's easy because they get income. They have a job, they get wages and income and high incomes and the like. What we don't have great data on is wealth. So if I'm a retiree from California and I'm bringing a lot of housing wealth and other wealth, and I move to Ashland and buy a nice place there, it doesn't necessarily, in terms of our data, it's harder to figure out, particularly in a place where we're not a sales tax state, and so we have more limitations on what we know about wealth and how that's used. That said, there are a lot more to retirees than just wealth. And in particular, it showed you the huge swing that we've seen in Central Oregon and in Bend. And that's a wonderful case where people are moving there who are maybe technically retired or semi-retired, but they're bringing a couple of their clients up to work on a couple of clients, or they're opening that fly tying shop that they always dreamed of, and very active and very promoting traditional economic activity as well in terms of investments and hiring and the like. And so there's a lot there, and it's really the advantage that our rural areas have over those in other states is this continued ability to draw people. And so we'll talk a little bit about that after the break, but that's a huge advantage. It's hard to measure how much.
Good morning. This is Jinx up here, and my question has to do with the distribution of wealth within the state. When logging and fishing pretty much collapsed, we didn't have a whole lot to fall back on. We weren't making cars. So what has happened over time with the distribution of wealth, the lower paying versus the higher paying jobs? I know stuff's great up in the Portland area, but where are the folks in the middle and the bottom over time?
Okay, in terms of regionally, the distribution of wealth has become more and more disparate, meaning the urban-rural divide has become more and more pronounced. We weren't sure this was a permanent thing a couple decades ago. We had seen it. We had the big shock when all the mills closed in the 80s, and we saw this gap start to develop, but we weren't sure it was going to continue to widen. But it certainly has in terms of the urban versus rural split. Now, in terms of the up and down the income spectrum, it's a little bit more complicated because what's really getting hit are the middle wage jobs. And you mentioned a couple of those, which were manufacturing jobs and resource jobs and the like, and some of those traditional male-held jobs, but also a lot of the other jobs that are getting killed by technology in terms of retail trade jobs or bank tellers or administrative assistants, right? Where technology, Microsoft Office has gotten rid of the need for thousands and thousands of administrative assistants and the like. And so what we've seen over time in terms of occupations is that we've seen growth in high wage occupations, growth in low wage occupations, nothing in the middle. There's still more people in these middle occupations, teachers and construction workers and the like, than there are in the others, if you're just looking at the gut, but they've just continue to erode as a share of the overall economy. These middle wage jobs get hammered in the recessions and they just don't come back in expansions, and technology is really the enemy there. Did you have that? Oh, indeed. The Salem number's right behind me. I'll let Josh explain because I just blabbered.
Yeah, and that's right? This is just high wage, middle wage, and low wage jobs. As Mark was saying, the classic story here of a manufacturing worker and those manufacturing jobs dry up, more particularly in our rural areas with the decline of the timber industry here in Oregon, but it also impacts women to the same degree. Those office and administrative support occupations that Mark was talking about, they have declined as a middle wage job for traditionally a female dominated occupation, have declined just as much as those manufacturing jobs have for men in the last generation. So this is the pattern we've seen for a couple decades now. It's been particularly pronounced since 2000 or so. For the last 16, 17 years, it's been very dramatic, more so than in the past. And so these are just the Salem specific numbers. It's important to point out that those high wage jobs, which is basically the top 20% of the wage distribution, roughly speaking, they're leading the recovery both in absolute numbers, like you see here, up 7,000 jobs, and as a percentage, right? Because they're a smaller share, so they've seen the big percentage increase. That's driving the growth. The biggest problem is here in the middle, and the problem here is also when you lose a middle wage job, what do? Something like 4%, 5% of former middle wage job workers are able to land a high wage job. Something like 15 to 30%, depending upon what we're talking about, middle wage job workers land a low wage job. That means 2/3 of the workers, 2/3 of the people that lose a middle wage job replace it with no job. They're one of those people that dropped out of the labor force entirely, and that's the problem. It's not just you take a big economic step down from a manufacturing job to a retail job, but you take a manufacturing job down to no job, and that's an even bigger decline. And so that's something that's been going on. It's going on in Portland, it's going on in Salem, it's going on in Grants Pass, it's going on in Youngstown, Ohio. It's a nationwide phenomenon, not necessarily phenomenon, problem, and it's been particularly pronounced.
Well, Josh, you and Mark make quite a team, passing the mic back and forth and locating the exact proper slide. We'll take a 10-minute break and be looking forward to the next hour. Thanks.
All right, so we'll go ahead and get started again. So a couple more comments about what's going on across the state in terms of how our recovery is starting to spread to more rural areas. And then we're going to talk a little bit about this big risk of housing affordability. I'll have Josh talk about that. Then we can dive into some of the state revenues with the remaining time. We have more slides than we're going to get to today, which was according to plan, but we'll see how many of them we can burn through. So across the across the regions of the state, we really had a different experience throughout this business cycle. This graph tries to show employment over time relative to where we were heading into the Great Recession. So we start here at 0% in the end of 2007 or so, and then throughout the recession we lose a bunch of our jobs. So about 8% statewide average we lost during the recession, but the experience of that drop was very similar no matter where you were in Oregon. Here we have three different lines, the light blue line being the Portland metropolitan area, the dark blue line being all our secondary metropolitan areas, Albany, Bend, Corvallis, Eugene, Grants Pass, Medford, and Salem. And then outside of metropolitan areas, the rural areas, as we loosely refer to them as the red line. So all of our areas pretty much suffered about the same, losing about 8% of their jobs over the Great Recession. But the experience coming out has been vastly different. Good old Portland had its traditional V-shaped recovery where, you know, as soon as they bottomed out in early 2010, they started adding jobs again and adding people as well. And you saw, you know, they returned to their pre-recession peak early in 2013. Very much a normal experience for Portland, other than the fact that the job losses were somewhat extreme. But everywhere else, there was nothing. Here we are in early 2013, Portland's all the way back, and we've really seen nothing outside of the metropolitan area. And a lot of that had to do with the nature of this downturn. In particular, what it hit hard. This downturn hit a couple things disproportionately hard. One we know of is housing-related industries, construction workers and the like, and lenders and appraisers and real estate agents and the like. And the thing about those, as well as the other industry that it hit hard, which was state and local government, particularly local government, K through 12 payrolls got hit really hard. They're very closely tied to property taxes in our rural areas as well. So we saw real big hits to the K through 12, which is typically a recessionary aid. But none of these, because of the housing downturn and the like, none of these turned around right away. It took we didn't see any building activity in most of these areas for a couple of good years, and still the permitting levels in most places aren't back to where they were, during the boom times, despite the shortage of housing. So until we started seeing the housing-related industries turn around, until we started seeing building pick up and construction pick up and the cuts stop in K through 12, we didn't see any improvement outside of the metropolitan areas. But now even our rural areas are growing, and by this measure as a whole, they're almost back to where they were before the recession started, the typical rural area. Now there's a lot of disparity across different rural areas, but at least pretty much all of them are growing. Right now we have 33 of our 36 counties are up on the year. That's about as good as it gets. We've been hovering around 33 to 35 over the last year or two, and that's about as good as it gets. So we are moving in the right direction. There are still several counties that are only about halfway back or 2/3 of the way back, and particularly those on the east side of the mountains and the south coast. I'm going to skip that one, and we're going to just move ahead and have a couple comments about affordability, and I'll pass it to Josh, can talk a little bit too. But we know housing affordability in our metropolitan areas is an issue, a big one in Portland in particular, but lesser known is that it is a problem all the way across the state, and that's what this map tries to show. What this map is looking at is a measure of housing affordability, which is looking at house prices over local incomes, the median incomes and median house prices, to see, well, what's the, how do those relate? Are prices way out of line with the local incomes? And as you notice, we're right here in Oregon in this sea of red. All our metropolitan areas here we've whited out, so we're just looking at rural counties across the country here. But in Oregon, that's all red, which means very unaffordable. Why is it unaffordable? It's really the price side. In terms of incomes, our incomes are just about on par with a typical rural area in rural Oregon, but our house prices are in the 95th percentile. Costs a lot, relatively. Now, some of this makes sense just by the nature of the measure. You'll see here that in particular for places on Oregon's coast, we'd expect them to be red. Resort and retirement areas, given that we're comparing house prices to local incomes, places that get a lot of housing demand from abroad for vacation homes and second homes are always going to show up relatively expensive. So you look in the ski resorts, or down in Florida, or Northeast, or the Boundary Waters in the upper Midwest, those places are all going to be relatively redder than the areas around them because of the vacation demand. But beside that, there's not a lot of vacation demand out here in Harney County, or Malheur County, so there's something more fundamental going on as well. And that becomes this threat, as we said, 5 times already, one of our main competitive advantages in Oregon is the ability to draw people when we need them. Well, this is one constraint to that potentially when we start having a shortage of affordable housing for folks in our workforce.
And so while it's a statewide problem at this point in terms of affordability, it's not just an urban-rural thing. And it's mostly a supply reason, right? The biggest reason why we have really high housing costs is we haven't built enough housing. And this is something that economists have been beating on for years now in terms of the prices going through the roof and affordability eroding. Well, what's going on? Well, we're not building, the people are moving here, the jobs have come back, but we're not building enough housing. And here locally in Salem, it's clearly the case. Housing starts, housing permits plummeted during the Great Recession and the housing bust. There's been hardly any signs of life in terms of a pickup of activity here locally. In some other communities, we've got a little increase. We're building more apartments than we used to, maybe a little bit. But overall, it's a supply problem. And to this point, then it becomes, well, why is it a supply problem? And so our office, we've dug a lot into this in the last couple of years. First diagnosing the problem as a supply issue, then trying to figure out, well, the demand's back, why isn't supply starting to come up? Because when the prices are out there, that means there's a lot of profit to be made, and developers are usually really risk-seeking in terms of, they know they can make money, they'll put a housing start in, and they know someone will come along and buy it. And so we've dug into a number of things. The first thing locally here in Oregon that people will talk about would be our land use problem, or land use issues, land use laws. I guess it's not necessarily a problem. And they say, well, that's the reason why we're not building enough homes. We restrict the supply of land, so therefore we can't build enough housing. I think there's no question that our land use laws impact housing prices, particularly over the long run. Our housing costs here in Oregon, as we just saw in rural Oregon, are significantly higher than they are in rural America. Our urban areas, same sort of issue, where they're in the top third of affordability problems across the country for our urban landscape too. And so that might be an issue. The land use laws do impact our costs over the long run. However, in the last 5 years, it's not just that we've underbuilt housing in Salem. We've underbuilt housing in Portland. And more importantly, we've underbuilt housing in Boise and in Dallas and in Austin and in Atlanta and some of these other places that really, really like to build housing. They have no land use restrictions whatsoever. We're underbuilding there too. So it's a nationwide problem, at least in the growing areas. And so if we're looking at a nationwide problem, using an Oregon-specific explanation to explain it, that doesn't get you very far, because I've never once heard anybody talk about Idaho's land use laws. But the vacancy rate, the amount of for-sale homes, the number of vacant apartments in Boise is the same as it is in Portland. And we know Portland's had all these problems, so that means Boise's having them too when you look at the data. We just maybe don't talk about Boise as much over here as we do our metropolitan areas here in Oregon. So what can explain it possibly from a U.S. level where the areas haven't underbuilt housing? And the one thing we've kind of zeroed in on are lenders. Financial lending to developers remain 60% lower today than it did a decade ago. And sure, getting back just to 2007 levels of building, just to get back to 2007 levels of building is not necessarily a good idea, given we were in the middle of a bubble and all the sort of fallout that comes from that. And so it makes some sense that we're not lending as much as we did a decade ago because of those financial issues that came out of it. But at the same time, this lending to single-family developers from our financial institutions across the U.S. Hasn't really increased much at all in the last 4 or 5 years. They built a lot of apartments, particularly a lot of apartments in the biggest urban centers in the country. So so they have a lot of housing loans on the books when it comes to assets and liabilities for banks, but it's primarily in the form of new apartments in downtown Portland and downtown Seattle and in downtown Denver and things like that. And so maybe that doesn't leave enough room left over for the single family developers, and there's also been increased regulations. Banks can't lend as much as they used to, even if they wanted to. They don't. It seems like they don't want to lend it too much at the same time. But things like Dodd-Frank put in some more regulations so that banks don't overextend themselves on housing like they did again last decade. And so some of this stuff makes sense, but it's filtering through the overall lending environment and impacting the supply until we get to the point where we're not building hardly anything, whether it's local or nationally, when it comes to new construction. And so that is the biggest driver of housing price trends, is the fact that demand's all the way back and supply is a trickle of what it needs to be relative to meet that demand. And so even though prices are all the way back to where they were, some people are worried about a bubble again and this and that. Well, the reason why we have high prices again today is fundamentally different than a decade ago, when it was really about prices can only go up. It doesn't matter what I pay for this house. I can sell it again in 2 years at a significant profit. That mentality is not back in the housing market today, at least based on all the survey data we have available. So again, high prices doesn't necessarily mean a bubble. We have a significant undersupply of housing driving that. The other thing that's going on here is, well, what new construction we do get is really expensive, right? We're talking, $400,000, $500,000, $600,000 for a new home today for new construction. A couple points about that. First, new construction is always expensive. It's always targeted towards the upper third of the income distribution, because material and labor and land and all that sort of stuff, it's expensive to build new housing first and foremost, and so it's always targeted towards those at the top, and so that is part of the issue. The other thing is we've had this massive shift within our income distribution, within the household income levels across the state. Here's an Salem chart. Where we're doing here is we're grouping households by income level. So the people that make less than $25,000 a year for their household, 20 to 50, 50 to 75, 75 to 100, and so forth. And then on the bar chart, left and right, is the change in the numerical number of households within each income category over the last decade. So 2007 to the newly released 2016 census data. We've had a decline in lower income households, and we've had a big increase in high income households, particularly high income households at $100,000 a year and above. And these folks can afford those $500,000 new construction homes. They can afford really high rents. So that's the other question. Is like, well, if we're only building luxury housing, this high income housing, who's able to afford it? Well, we have here in Salem, we have 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 more households today than we did a decade ago that have $100,000 of income and above. This change here that you're seeing, again, is largely for good economic reasons. People are making more money today than they did a decade ago, and if on a per worker basis, maybe it hasn't increased as much, well, we now have more earners per household, so the spouse is starting to work at the same time, so you have two incomes instead of one, and so this filtering, fewer lower income households, more higher income households, is largely for a good economic story. And so this is changing the housing market too, because we have more households here at the upper end. And it should be important to point out that the vast majority of the Salem population is not in these income brackets, right? The vast majority of the Salem population is here in, maybe 40, 50, 60, 70,000. These two bars right here, this is where most Salem households are. It's just that net number, that net increase is occurring at the top end. And so that's transforming the housing market too. Lastly, when it comes to the housing market, something that's being discussed quite a bit in the last decade when it comes to our urban areas in particular, is the issue of multifamily versus single family and the urban renaissance. And we've seen downtowns revitalized and lots of apartments going into downtown areas, more so than we have historically. Part of the issue is we've had this massive shift from home ownership a decade ago during the housing boom to big increase in rentership in the last decade. There's been three reasons for that. One is financial. You lose your job, you lose your income, maybe you got foreclosed on, so people have been forced into the renters market. The second one is demographics. At this same time period, as we talked about earlier with school enrollments, the peak millennial aged into their college years and now into their young adulthood here during this time period too. So we have a whole lot more 24, 25, 26-year-olds today than we did a decade ago. And so when you're in your early 20s, what do? You rent. You rent in an apartment, right? Just because where you are in your life cycle. As you start to age, as you start to transition into your 30s and into your 40s, you get married, you settle down, you have a kid, maybe you get a promotion, and suddenly that single-family home in the suburbs with the good school district looks a lot better than it does when you're 23 wanting some nightlife activity around your apartment. And we've seen that too, right? That's impacted these trends considerably. And both of those ones, household finances and the demographics, are now shifting away from rentership and towards home ownership. And so here in Salem, we haven't seen home ownership rise. We have in a lot of the large metropolitan areas across the country, something like 70, so 2/3 to 3/4 of the biggest metros in the entire country, home ownership went up last year. In Portland, it's gone up for 2 years in a row now. I'd expect the Salem numbers to increase in the next few years as well, partly due to those demographics. Household incomes are back, and the peak millennials are starting to enter to those years where they are starting to settle down. And sure, they're doing it a couple years later than previous generations, but you still do that as you mature and enter into your 30s. And so our office a couple years ago issued a report asking if we're at peak renter today. And they got a decent amount of pushback, because particularly coming from the Portland metropolitan area, where they just say, oh, we're just going to build apartments in downtown Portland. We have some of our friends and some of our economists saying we don't need to build any more single-family homes. We have enough of that. We just need apartments. Well, that's a little bit of an extreme case. And we laid out those arguments of household finances, demographics, and then the third component is consumer preferences and tastes, right? What do people actually want to live in? And sure, there's been a little bit of a swing towards urban living and living near amenities, bars and restaurants and museums and that sort of stuff. There's been a little bit of a shift towards that. But if you look at all the survey results, most people still say they want a detached single-family home. The question is whether they can afford it or not. And so we laid that out a couple years ago, but now the data started to come in. And here in Salem, we're at peak renter today. We just haven't seen home ownership increase again, but we've seen the erosion and shift to rentership stop. And again, in a lot of our other areas, we started to see home ownership come back at all. So that composition within the housing market, we have more higher income households than we've ever had before, and we're going to start to see home ownership come back, means the nature of the new construction we need to build to meet the demands of this population is also shifting over time as well. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mark, and we're going to talk about revenue for the last chunk.
Yeah, thanks. So how does this whole economic outlook we've been giving you, how does this translate into the state budgets and the state revenues, which is really our domain? And a lot of it is very similar to what we've seen, in terms of the job market. That is, in the revenue side of things, money coming in the state, we've been doing pretty darn well over the last 3 or 4 years. We've been bringing in quite a bit of revenue. We got right back up to our pre-recession peak in available resources in no time for the state, but we're still having issues in terms of budget issues. And so these are what they call structural instead of cyclical. Cyclical being, okay, yeah, our revenues go up and down, and they're back on an upswing, but the issue is over the long term, what about that long-term trajectory of our revenues in relationship to costs and to spending? And what's happened in the last several years, partly because of the recession, but partly not, is that we're having trouble keeping up with the cost of providing the same level of public services. That's what our budget shop does, every couple years, is they say, okay, what if we tried to do everything that we did these 2 years? How much would it cost? And that's tough to keep up with. In particular, the costs of medical care have been increasing rapidly, and also the help needed for state and for our local government partners as well. And a lot of that has to do with the pension costs and the like. So the trouble really is keeping up. But in terms of the revenue side, things have been pretty good, but now we're starting to see this transition down, just like with the employment and the job numbers coming down to something that's a little bit more sustainable. So this is data out of tax returns in Oregon, looking at the orange is 2014, blue is 2015, and black would be the preliminary 2016, meaning the people, when you just filed your taxes in April of 2017, about that 2016 tax year, that's the most recent tax year we have. And so what you see here is across all kinds of income. Here we're looking at the different things that you'll see on your 1040 tax return, all the different little boxes you fill out. And as you see across the board, whether we're talking about investment income or retirement income or Social Security, pensions, IRAs, or traditional wage income, everything was pretty much slower in 2015 and even slower yet in 2016 across the board, other than interest, which is you know, now that we're starting to finally see a little bit of increase in interest rates, or we've seen some tick up in taxable interest income, but that's really a change from a very low level to still a very low level. But nevertheless, we've seen this this ratchet down, and qualitatively that's exactly what we've been telling the legislature, and what we told them in May of 2015 when we set this budget was that yes, we're going to start to, you know, that the best times are behind us, we're not going to go full throttle anymore, we're going to transition down to a sustainable rate. But unfortunately, we didn't get that exactly right. We thought that transition and the slowdown would be even a little faster than you see here. And in fact, in terms of personal income tax, we were looking at about, we missed by 2.3%, 2.7% when you look at the whole thing. This is the kicker. The way the kicker works is in May 2015, we have to give to that legislature, say, okay, this is how much money you have to spend. You're going to have $16.9 billion to spend of non-corporate tax revenue in the general fund. And so then we go back and we look once the biennium is over, we put the numbers to bed and we see, does that, you know, is what actually came in, is it within 2% of what we expected? And in this case, no. We're a little bit above the 2% threshold. The problem with that, the tricky thing about the kicker law is now we have to refund not just that excess, $125 million, but this first 2% as well. So all of that goes back to the taxpayer, that first 2% as well. So when we're hovering right around here and there's a lot of uncertainty in the April tax returns, there's also a lot of uncertainty in terms of the amount available. So this means we can't really win high or low. I think a lot of, you know, if we undershoot the forecast, well, then we have to give it all back and the policymakers aren't happy. If we overshoot the forecast, well, then there's not enough money and they have to make midterm cuts or tax increases, and then they're really not happy. And so we're stuck in a place. But the silver lining is this isn't all bad in terms of the process. A lot of our counterparts in other states like to lowball. They like to, you know, try to keep the number very conservative so that they don't have to show up with a hat in hand saying, sorry, there's not enough money. You know, it's easier for them to say, oh, look, there's more money. Look, we have extra money, you know, and they do this time and time again. This is a little bit, in some senses, a little bit better because the legislature gets our best guess here in Oregon, and then they get to decide how much to save today versus how much to spend, rather than the bureaucrat implicitly deciding how much to save by how low they go in terms of the outlook. So there is, I suppose, a silver lining. That said, the legislature isn't very good at saving, so maybe it's not the best idea. So what's going to go on with this kicker that you're going to be getting? Well, 4 years ago, the legislature made a change to the kicker law. Originally, not the very originally, but for 20 or 30 years, it had been the case that when the legislature has a kicker, that they went and issued it as a check around Christmas time. Everybody got a check in the mail around Christmas time, said, oh, this is great, you know, and that obviously had benefits. Our Senator Gordon Smith, it was his idea, and constituents liked that a lot, but there was a problem with that. That if you gave around a check around Christmas time, maybe we didn't have the money for it as a state. In particular, there was, administrative costs, cost a lot to send out a check, and there's more fraud and stuff when you put checks in boxes. But the main issue was we're an income tax state, and we have to wait till April till the money comes in. If we're waiting until April till the money comes in, and we have to give a double school payment on the first day of the biennium, we kind of don't have any money in November and December right as we start up the biennium. We're spending more than we're taking in. And so if in an extreme case, back in 2005 when we had a kicker of $1.2 billion, the state had to go out and borrow $1.2 billion in the credit market and pay interest in order to pay it out to folks, and that was a considerable interest charge. And so the idea was, okay, instead of this, now we'll just make it part of the tax return process. So next year, when you file your taxes for the 2017 tax year, you'll be April 2018, you'll be filling this out, you'll get a refund based on what you paid this year. Some share of what you paid this year, roughly 6%, gets paid out. So while that's better for the process in terms of saving the interest costs, makes it a little harder to figure out when it's going to come out of the revenue stream from a forecaster's perspective. And so we have to try to, looking at the last one, we have a little bit better idea this time that, some of it comes out as, okay, I was going to get a tax refund from Oregon anyway, and now I get a bigger one. Some of it is, oh, I was going to pay Oregon, so now I have to pay less at the end of the year. And then we have some people who say, okay, just keep it and put it toward my taxes next year. And then there's these ones, which we actually got a little bit more of when we did it in a check, which are offsets in particular. So if you owe taxes to the Department of Revenue, or you owe community college tuition, or you owe child support, we're going to be keeping that check. So now it's a little harder to get that stuff because it's through the tax revenue. If someone's not filing or not paying anyway, you don't get the check. But in the past we did. But that is still significant as well. So some of that is just in terms of deaths that aren't paid out. But for you guys that don't owe child support in the room, this is roughly what we're looking at. So as with, you're getting a share of what you paid in 2016. So it is really skewed towards higher income folks, because higher income folks are paying in gross dollars in Oregon more. Our system is relatively flat in terms of what percentage of income, which is good relative to other states, or fair relative to other states, where low income households pay roughly the same share of their income as high income households. But high income households have more. So, when we're talking about the top 1%ers, we're looking at about a $5,000 kicker refund. Whereas the median person in the middle, somewhere $30,000–$35,000 in AGI, is more like $90 off your taxes. And so the benefit of this kicker is certainly skewed towards the top, but not unlike what was put in. It reflects exactly what the share that was put in. But you can see from this chart why whenever we show this to the revenue committee, there are certain members of the committee that already have their heads spinning about, well, what about flat per capita, or what about capping the amount of kicker to give, to try to make this a little bit more equitable, or at least in raw numbers. And so for what we're looking at going forward, it has been pretty stable over time. This is what we're looking at in the current biennium, which just started this summer and goes for 2 years. These were our forecasts over time, and they have been inching up a little bit. Our outlooks for what we would get in this biennium. The first one that mattered at all, was this December of 2016. That was the one that the governor's recommended budget was based on. So the first one that this actually got used, although we've been putting it in front of the legislature for some time, the first one that got used was December of 2016. Governor Brown set her budget to that. And then the most important one is the May of 2017, which the legislature set their budget to. You'll notice they added that red section, close of session changes, go ahead and pull in some more money with different tax law changes. And from the standpoint of the kicker law, we fold that in. We take whatever we forecast plus the estimate of what their policy changes do and say, okay, that's the threshold. And then we adjusted it a little bit in September after we had a real big end year and added a little bit, but we're still roughly where we were when the budgets were drafted this summer. So that's cyclical, so we're back, but structural, again, the long term is the problem. What our budget director calls the alligator chart. He says, okay, there's the trajectory of cost, there's a trajectory of revenues, there's a problem here. And so what do? Well, our bailiwick, or our expertise is on the revenue side. And the revenue side, a lot of it is a demographic issue. For the primary state tax revenue instruments are becoming less effective than they were in the past. We know demographics are already weighing on overall economic growth, right? That the economy isn't growing as fast as we used to because of the baby boom population cohort reaching their retirement age. We're not just losing any workers from the workforce, we're losing very productive workers with a lifetime of experience. And this is drawing down our ability to grow. But even if we were able to have the economy grow at the same rate as it used to, we would still be seeing some weight on the state budget instruments because of the aging population. For us, as an income tax state, this picture is the one. This looks at, okay, as you age up, as folks age, how much income in Oregon are they getting? How much average income are they getting by source? And this big red bulge is your wage and salary employment, or income, that peaks somewhere in your 40s and 50s, in your peak earning years. And that's a big ton of it. But then it rapidly, as people enter in their 60s and 70s, that wage component goes away and it gets replaced. It gets replaced by what? Some retirement component, of which not all of it is taxable, our rental income, and the big Social Security, of which most of it isn't taxable by Oregon. None of it is. Some of it's federally taxable, but none of it is by Oregon. So, and even if we did, we're still seeing a significant decline in average income as they age anyway. So as we get into this bulge of population heading out here, these traditional income taxes are becoming less effective at pulling out the revenue. But it's not just income tax states that have a problem. In fact, our sales tax states are struggling even more. Right, so sales tax states have the issue of, well, they're dependent on these big ticket durable goods, cars, home furnishings, and the like, and electronics and the big ticket stuff, because because that's what they typically tax. And a lot of them don't tax things like services, particularly hospital services, medical services, drugs, things that maybe as an aging population, people are getting more and more services. And as you get older, you're buying fewer and fewer cars and fewer sofas over time. And so that's what we're seeing here, that grandma spends less on a lot of stuff that we tax. Education is typically not taxed, but all the transportation, home furnishings, entertainment, the like, transportation has the cars in it. Meanwhile, they spend more on what? Healthcare, reading. We could tax books, but that's only going to be a little bit. And so what we're seeing across the country with sales tax states is, boy, as a share of overall economic activity, the sales taxes are eroding and a lot faster than our income taxes. So this is something that gets forgotten sometimes in the debate about tax reform here in Oregon. People say, okay, we have this real volatile income tax stream, right? But so why don't we get some eggs in other baskets, try to diversify over time, and we know that sales taxes are more stable from year to year. They change we tease our folks from, our counterparts in sales tax states when they crow about how well they've done projecting their sales tax revenues. We tell, well, yeah, but that's because you guys pitch underhand. I mean, it's a lot different to forecast when we go up by 15% a year, or down by 15% a year. They're like, okay, is it 3-4%, or is it maybe 2.5%? It's really not that tricky. So while it's stable, though, there's a risk and return element, and we get more in any given year in terms of income growth, in terms of revenue growth. And so the volatility, in a way, is really a management problem, right? If you're able to save, for the lean years, well, then it's probably better to have the volatile income tax than the stable but slow and eroding sales tax. So that's just one thing that gets forgotten in it. But there is a lot to do to stability, particularly if you're a policymaker. The stability is important as well. But here's the concept of risk versus return. We're looking at Washington versus Oregon. Now this changed. Washington's had a big boom. This was even more extreme most recently. But in the typical year, or Washington's getting about 7% growth in their sales tax, whereas Oregon gets 8% in the typical year in income tax. But our dispersion, the possibilities here, are much wider, in terms of the typical deviation of these things from its mean. So easier to predict, but further to the left, not as quickly growing in the given year. So I'll let Josh talk about the little ones, but so what do you do about reform? I mean, I don't know. I've had governor's policy advisors ask you, so what would you do if you can't increase the sales tax, which some people based on a 1990 survey have determined that Oregon will never have a sales tax. I'm not so sure that's true, but it is conventional wisdom out there, is because some poorly phrased survey question in the 1990s came back with, bad results, we'll never have a sales tax. So if you can't have a sales tax and you can't increase the property taxes because it's in the Constitution and people hate property taxes, what do? It's like, well, there's not much left, right? So that's why they're attacking these corporate taxes, and they're looking at different business taxes and stuff like that, because there's not a whole lot left. I would like to see people, I know it's tough with being in the Constitution, but I think we need to address the property taxes a little bit more personally, but that's very hard to do, because it looks like when you shift to a property tax, it tends to make the system more regressive. What do I mean by that? It means higher rates of taxation on lower income folks. But with property taxes, again, that's hard to say because of this issue that came up earlier with wealth versus income, right? We can have retirees with very low fixed incomes, but a mansion and a lot of wealth, and so how do we exploit that? We don't want, poor grandma, if she has a fixed income, doesn't have anything, but does own her little house, you don't want to tax her a ton, right? But at the same time, if grandma moved from San Francisco, is sitting in Ashland, on a pile of gold, it would be maybe nice to get a little bit of that gold. I don't know, or even so, even maybe you're just plain old little simple grandma, but you happen to buy a house in Irvington or Sellwood, 50 years ago for nothing. And so now you have a fixed income and you own your house outright, but your house is worth a ton. So theoretically, we could potentially tap out of some of that wealth as well, but that's, again, a lot trickier, and I know in terms of a political problem, probably too heavy of a lift. So we have a couple of fun things. I think I burnt too much time, but I'll let Josh talk about the highlights of our other taxes, in particular, a lot of our vice taxes that are doing particularly well right now.
We get to look at a lot of fun things. And first off, when it also comes to a revenue source, and when we come to a place that has significantly widening economic inequality is going through the roof, we're only one of a handful of states that still has an estate tax. When they did federal reform in the mid-2000s, some of the Bush-era tax cuts at the federal level, it also ended up getting rid of a lot of state and local or state estate taxes. And Oregon is one of the only few states that said, well, if they're getting rid of the federal one and the way we manage it, well, we're going to institute our own. And so we still have one here in Oregon. And these numbers have been going through the roof quite a bit in recent years, significantly above forecast, to the point where it was a major contributor to the kicker in this most recent biennium for a revenue stream that's only bringing in a couple $100 million a year, which to you means astronomical, but to the state budget where we're talking about 16, 17, 18 billion dollars of revenue, a couple hundred's not a lot. But we started looking into it. What is the source of this error? Where is this revenue coming from? And if we look over the last decade, last 15 years, we haven't seen a massive increase in the number of estates paying it. We have $1 million threshold, and yes, $1 million today isn't what it once was, particularly when it comes to, say, homes and estates. In the Portland metropolitan area, there's a lot more $1 million homes today given the housing market than before, but we haven't seen that big of an increase in the people paying it. But what we have seen is a big increase in estates valued at more than $5 million, and it's an even bigger increase of estates valued at more than 10 or 15 or $20 million, and their average tax is up to 300%. So in this world of widening inequality, where we're having a few estates worth these astronomical sums, when people do pass away, it's resulting in large tax increases or tax revenue gains for the state. And so there's a couple competing theories here that we kind of build into our forecast for this. Is yes, inequality is maintaining at a high level. We have asset markets rising. We have a small handful of really valuable estates in the state of Oregon. When we talk to tax planners and accountants, it's a really easy thing to plan around for the most part in terms of gifting and managing your estate and things like that. So long term, even though asset prices are going up and we have an aging demographic, you can manage it and plan around it. The challenge there and the problem there becomes when we have people that pass away earlier in life than maybe they actuarially should, right? And, in terms of maybe not getting your estate planning fully developed, and maybe something happens when you're younger, in your 40s or your 50s or something like that. And so that's also compounding here. But all of our accountants and whatnot say, yeah, it's going to go increase up over time because of the rising asset markets and the aging of the population. But that said, it's not going to go through the roof forever because you're able to manage and plan around that. So that's something that's been a big issue for our revenue forecast in recent years. A couple quick notes on other things that are happening. First, with the lottery, this is the second largest revenue source that the legislature really gets to spend in a discretionary manner behind personal income taxes. Here, the biggest local development is the new tribal casino in La Center, Washington, L&A resort from the Cowlitz tribe. For a long time, no one ever thought the Cowlitz would actually get that land in trust and get a reservation, a casino built. Well, they did, and they put it in place, and we built a big economic impact, a big revenue hit, because there's so many lottery sales on the border. You go up to Portland in the Park Rose neighborhood or on Hayden Island on those two I-5 bridges. There's tons and tons and tons. That's like 10% of lottery sales across the state are right there across from Washington, and there's a lot of Washingtonians playing there, right? Because they don't have the same video lottery games in the state of Washington that we have here in Oregon, so we get cross-border impacts. And so if there's a casino in Washington, we're going to lose a lot of that money. So we built in a pretty hefty decline in lottery sales due to the new casino, and to date, we've seen a very small impact. We're talking our forecast, our mistake was off by 75%. We're seeing 25% of the impact that we predicted we would see. And it's not just us, it's a bad mistake on our part, but if you look at Spirit Mountain expected a big impact too, and they're getting maybe 40% of their expected impact. So what's happening here? Why aren't we seeing a big of an impact from a new casino in Washington here on state revenues and our local tribes too, and we don't really know. We know the new casino had a problematic rollout. Those two bridges across the Willamette or across the Columbia act as major constraints. People don't want to drive up there and sit through that traffic to get to it, and so those are some of the other impacts that we're seeing. And so this is the most recent one. So this is more revenue to the state because the tribal impact is less than expected. The newest revenue stream for the state of Oregon is marijuana, recreational marijuana receipts. And this is something our office just was officially tasked with in recent months. During the session, they have given our office the duties of forecasting recreational marijuana. And so what we've done so far is we set up a process, and we are basically tracking our revenue in red compared to Colorado and Washington, which are basically 2 years ahead of us on this path of legalization and the revenue streams that they're seeing, and we're kind of pegging our forecast to be similar to what they're seeing. Because we don't have enough data, we don't have enough history of a legalized marketplace to develop a full-fledged model, or not one that's really useful. And so we're kind of pegging it to what we're seeing in Colorado and Washington. We did put in a bump for the eclipse. We had a lot more tourists here, and they're just going to be hanging out outside looking at the sky for a while. We thought they might partake in some recreational activities. We don't have that tax return data yet. That's coming in a few weeks, so we'll see how right we were about it. But with that, it's something we're starting to think more about. It's becoming a larger revenue stream. That said, it's still very small. It's about the same size as other tobacco products, which are cigars and chew and snuff. and snus and all that sort of stuff, that's about the same size of the tax revenue stream for marijuana is the non-cigarette tobacco revenues. And so with that, we'll leave it open for some questions before we have to head out.
Good morning. My name is Bob. I'm back here. And my question goes back to property taxes. I understand the rationale for capping the growth of assessed value, or at least taxable assessed value. That's what it really is. While a person's living in the home, their income may not be growing as fast as their home value is growing. But why not capture the appreciated value at the time of transfer, when the home is sold or at the time of death? I don't know, I don't hear any discussion about that. What's your comment?
Okay, that is a possibility. They do something similar to that in California that has property tax constraints, but then they reset on sale or whatnot. And this is something that that our counties, and particularly the League of Cities lobbyist group, has been promoting in our legislature the last couple of rounds. They would love to do one of these sale resets. Now, in addition to increasing taxes, which nobody likes, again, property tax, the other reason this is unpopular is the housing industries. They don't want a constraint on their transactions. They don't want this penalty to sell, right? You know, and keeping people in. They would rather have, you know, a more fluid market.
The only other thing I would add to that, and this is counterintuitive to my perspective on it. Fred Thompson from here at the University of Willamette, I think he's officially retired now, because we went to his retirement party a couple months ago. But I'm sure he's still around doing some work. He looked at the individual transaction data for Portland specifically, maybe the whole metro, I forget. And right now we have massive home equity issues because we're basing our property tax system on 1995 values. So we fixed in time 1995 value. So if you had a high valuation in 1995, your property taxes today are different than if you had a low valuation in 1995, right? So you get neighborhood disparities in the Portland region in particular, but throughout the state. Fred's research showed that if we had the California system in place, that disparity, that horizontal inequity within the housing market would be worse today than under the current system. You would think that if you adjust property taxes with every transaction and to get back to market or what have you, it would make it more equal over time, but that was a little bit eye-opening. And we know California's horizontal equity issues are massive too, because you bought that home in Palo Alto in 1955 and now you're still paying $2,000 a year in property taxes on a $2 million estate. And so having some adjustment mechanism makes sense, but the research has shown in a numerical sense that particular one actually makes it worse, which again is counterintuitive to how I would have thought it would look.
Right here. Excuse me. This is Irene. This is about the housing, and it's the affordable housing for the middle class. And I heard this on CNBC, a builder in Colorado who says he can no longer build those houses because during the Great Recession, all the migrant people who used to do the building and were skilled in that, they returned to Mexico. They haven't come back because they don't want to be deported again or be deported. How has, how has the migrant builders affected Oregon building industry?
I think we can see that. One of the issues, that's one of the things that everyone says, okay, why are we not building? One of them is a shortage of construction workers. I can't get anybody to come work for me. And so we looked into that a little bit. One of the things you'd expect to see is if there's a shortage of construction workers, that their wage increases should be faster than the typical industry where there isn't a shortage. And we don't see that at the top line. So that's, puts a little, makes us wonder about this, but it's anecdotally true. People say they're having trouble. So what's going on? Well, One of the things that might be going on, and the folks, and particularly in Portland, people say, is that it's a middleman issue. It's a bottleneck, that we only have a very few number of contractors now that are larger, and they're taking all the profit, and they're not giving it to the workers, right? So we've got some middlemen here that are gumming up the works. And that might be possible, and while we don't have data on minorities, we do have data on how many of these establishments are created and the age of the workforce. And what happened after the Great Recession is we lost all of these young, in their 20s, folks that were traditionally in the trades. So some of which were immigrants, some of which were not. But we lost all these young folks that were in the trades because there were no jobs and they were just starting out, right? And so what happens? Well, now here we are coming out of it, and while we've seen the number of construction workers bounce back up, we haven't seen the number of firms get up, and we're not seeing this new firm creation. What used to happen when you're a young worker in the trades, you work for somebody else for 5 years and you figure it out and say, well, you know, I'm going to split off and do some of this myself. And so all those new establishments created that create, you know, that we haven't seen. So there may well be something to this workforce issue because of what we're seeing in the age data and the, you know, the creation of construction firms.
Well, I promised Josh and Mark that we'd let them go a little early because they don't have to speak again until 1 o'clock. So you know they're popular. And believe me, it's a thrill for us to have you come here and share your research with us and give us some clues about what's ahead. Thanks very much.
We always enjoy it.